The winter sun is slipping away, sliding behind the hills like it's too tired to try today. In a small medieval village, the cold evening settles in slowly, almost softly, like a giant frost-covered blanket being pulled across the land. The air is so chilly, it feels like it might bite your nose off if you stay outside too long. But even in the cold, everything looks peaceful, calm, sleepy. The little houses, made of wood, mud, and whatever else was lying around centuries ago, sit close together like they're huddling for warmth. Smoke rises lazily from a few thatched roofs, curling into the gray sky. The smell of burning wood and dinner leftovers floats through the air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog is barking at absolutely nothing, because that's what medieval dogs did best. As night begins to fall, the village becomes slow. Not because they're relaxing on purpose, but because everything takes energy, and nobody wants to waste even a little warmth. People move gently, carefully, sweeping the last bit of snow from their doorways, checking on the animals, making sure the woodpile has at least a little something left. It's the medieval version of locking up the house at night, except draftier, colder, and with more chickens staring at you. Inside one of the homes, the day is winding down. The family has finished their supper, something warm and simple, probably a pottage thick enough to stand a spoon in. Maybe some bread that could also double as a blunt weapon because medieval bread had personality. The room still holds the cozy heat from the cooking fire, though everyone knows it won't last long once they let the flames die down to save fuel. It's dim indoors, but not dark. The fire in the hearth is giving off a soft orange glow, flickering across the walls. Shadows dance quietly across rough wooden beams. A candle or two might be burning, but candles are precious, so the room is mostly lit by firelight alone. The warmth from the flames is gentle, nothing dramatic, just enough to make your fingers feel alive again after a day in the cold. The family sits close together, sharing the best spot near the hearth, because nobody's trying to be a hero and sit far away. If you want drama, you can wait until summer. Winter is for survival. Outside, the village is growing quieter. The chickens are tucked in, the goats are complaining less, and the cows are doing their slow, sleepy breathing. The snow crunches under the last few footsteps as people head indoors. There aren't any streetlights, of course, just the faint spill of firelight escaping through cracks in doorways. The world outside looks almost magical, like the whole village is holding its breath under the weight of winter. If you could listen closely, you'd hear the wind brushing against the walls, giving the houses a little push, as if to check to see if they're still standing. The houses, being stubborn medieval houses, stay perfectly still. The wind sighs and moves on. Inside again, the family settles into their nighttime rhythm. Someone might be mending a torn piece of clothing with numb fingers. Someone else is telling a quiet story. Maybe something about a wandering saint, a local superstition, or even a funny moment from the summer when life didn't feel like one long shiver. And then there's always the young kid who asks when will winter end, and the parents give a wise-sounding answer like soon, even though winter has only just begun and they all know it. The heat from the fire is fading little by little. They know exactly how long it will last. Years of winter evenings have trained them well. They can feel the moment the last strong bit of warmth slips away and the cold starts creeping back in. Not suddenly, just a slow, quiet chill, sneaking like a cat across the floor. They don't panic, though. This is normal. Every medieval peasant knows that winter nights belong to the cold, but they also know how to make the most of whatever warmth they have left. Someone adds a few more sticks to the fire. Not too many. Wood is precious. You ration it the same way you ration hope during tax season. The room brightens just a little. The fire crackles softly, shooting up a few sparks that disappear as quickly as they appear. There's something comforting about that sound. It's a reminder that even in the deep cold, there is still a small light holding on. Outside the window, if the house even has a window, it's fully dark now. The sky is heavy with winter clouds, and any moonlight that tries to break through is smothered almost instantly. It's the kind of darkness that feels deep, thick, ancient. The kind you don't fight, you just accept it and go inside. This moment, right here, is the quietest part of the day. No fields to plow, no tools to swing, no markets to walk to. Just warm breath rising into the cold air of a small room. Just the soft murmur of a family getting ready to sleep through another winter night. The fire continues to glow gently, and the room feels like a little island of warmth in a sea of freezing darkness. You can almost feel the contrast, the heavy cold pressing against the outside walls and the fragile warmth clinging to the inside. It makes everything feel slower, calmer, like time has decided to take a break. Someone yawns, another follows. It's contagious, even in the Middle Ages. They begin preparing for bed, pulling out blankets, arranging straw mattresses, shaking off the cold from their clothes. They laugh softly at some small joke. Maybe the father pretends his toes have frozen off again. Maybe the mother teases him about complaining every single winter. The children settle down, wrapping themselves in wool, blankets, and each other. The elders move slower, but with an old, practiced rhythm. Everyone knows their place. Everyone knows how to make the space as warm as possible before finally lying down to rest. The last thing to do is bank the fire, pressing ashes over the glowing embers so it sleeps through the night instead of dying completely. Tomorrow morning, those tiny red sparks will be enough to bring the fire back to life, a little warmth saved for another day. As the family drifts off to sleep, the house grows quiet. Just the low hum of breathing, the occasional shift of straw, and the steady winter wind moving outside. And in this moment, in this humble home in a medieval village, the coldest season becomes something soft, almost comforting, almost cozy. Winter is harsh, yes, but here, in the glow of the hearth, under layers of wool and straw, the night feels peaceful. It feels like a place where you too could fall asleep. Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't just a bit cold. It wasn't the kind of cold where you throw on a hoodie and complain for 5 minutes. No, medieval winter was the kind of cold that made you question your life choices. The kind of cold that made your bones feel like they were filing a complaint. The kind of cold where if you dropped your bread outside, it might shatter like glass. To put it simply, medieval winter was serious business. The landscape would change the moment winter began. The fields that were lively in summer turned into icy, empty spaces. The trees stood there like sad skeletons. Rivers would freeze so hard that people could walk across them, and sometimes even animals would wander onto the ice like, well, this is new. The sun didn't help much either. It showed up late, left early, and spent the few hours it was around looking weak and tired, like it really needed a coffee. Daylight was precious and short, maybe 8 hours on a good winter day. And even then, most of that daylight was dim, the kind of light where you look outside and say, is it morning or almost night? And the answer would be yes. But for medieval peasants, this wasn't strange. This was normal. Every year, the cold arrived like an unwelcome guest who never knocked and definitely didn't wipe their feet on the mat. And every year, the villagers did what they always did. They prepared, they worked, they worried a little, and then they braved the winter one day at a time. The temperature could drop dangerously low, especially in Northern Europe. People didn't have thermometers back then, but their noses and toes provided all the information they needed.
When your eyelashes freeze together, you don't need a number. You just know it's cold. The wind was another problem. Sharp, slicing, and determined. It would slip through every crack in the walls, wiggle through tiny gaps in windows, and sneak under doors like it was playing hide and seek with your warmth. A gust of wind could turn a warm room back into an ice cave in minutes. And since most medieval houses weren't exactly built with insulation in mind, the cold had a lot of ways to invade. Imagine a house made of mud, sticks, and hope. Now imagine that house trying to stop winter from getting in. Yeah, it didn't stand much chance. Snowstorms were common too. When snow piled up, it didn't politely sit in the yard like it does today. It gathered on roofs, weighed down thatched coverings, and sometimes even fell inside the home if the roof wasn't in a good mood. Peasants had to shake snow from the roof with long poles so their houses didn't collapse. Winter wasn't something you admired from your window. It was something you fought so your roof didn't flatten your cow. But even with all this cold and snow and wind that seemed personally offended by human existence, medieval villagers were surprisingly calm about winter. After all, winter followed a rhythm. It came every year. It stayed for months. It made people miserable, but then it left, and knowing that pattern helped people prepare for it. Before winter came, peasants would store food like squirrels: grain, beans, dried herbs, anything that could survive the winter. They collected firewood or whatever they could burn. Spoiler alert, it wasn't always wood. Peasants burned anything that would light: peat, straw bundles, dried dung, even old bits of broken tools. If it could catch fire without exploding, into the hearth it went. They also prepared emotionally. Winter meant less farming, less travel, more long nights, and more time stuck indoors listening to Uncle Bernard's endless stories about the same cow that got lost 3 winters ago. People had to be mentally ready to deal with hunger, boredom, and cold toes for months. And despite everything, there was still beauty in the winter season. When the snow settled on the village rooftops, when the frost sparkled on the fields, when everything grew quiet and still, winter could look magical, peaceful, like someone had placed the entire village inside a snow globe and whispered, "Shh, slow down." In a strange way, winter forced life to quiet down. No plowing, no harvesting, no rushing to the market at dawn. People slowed their steps. They worked indoors instead of outdoors. They spent more time with family. They shared simple meals and simple moments. Winter brought hardship, yes, but it also brought closeness. And even though medieval peasants were constantly cold, and I mean constantly, they still found a way to get through each day. They didn't have heated blankets, they didn't have steaming hot showers, they even didn't have socks like we do today. They had wool and hope and the ability to adapt. The coldest winters, the ones people would talk about for years afterwards, were terrifying. Lakes froze so solid that caravans crossed them. Entire herds could die if snow fell too quickly. Food stores could run out. But even then, peasants found ways to cope. They shared resources with neighbors. They moved animals into the home for warmth. They squeezed together in bed like they were part of one giant medieval burrito. They survived because they had no choice but to survive. It's easy for us now to look back and imagine medieval winter as purely miserable. But for the people who lived it, it was a mix of hardship and routine. Yes, the cold was harsh. Yes, winter tested every person in the village. But winter also brought a certain kind of stillness that summer never offered. Imagine waking up in a house that is freezing, yes, but also quiet. The fire's embers glowing softly, no birds shouting at you from trees, no farmers yelling across fields, just silence, your own breath, and the slow stretching of the world waking up under snow. Winter shaped life in the Middle Ages. It slowed things down, made people tougher, and taught them what real cold felt like. And even though peasants didn't have much, they had each other. They had shared warmth, shared food, shared stories, and that made the cold just a little more bearable. So when we talk about medieval winters, remember this: they weren't just seasons. They were challenges, teachers, and reminders of just how strong ordinary people were. And now that we understand how brutal winter could be, We can finally step into their homes and see how they actually stayed warm on those freezing nights.
When you picture a medieval peasant home, don't imagine something fancy. Don't imagine stone walls, grand fireplaces, or fluffy beds with curtains like in movies. No, no. A real peasant house was simple, very simple. The kind of simple where you walk in, look around, and say, "Ah, yes, this is definitely a home built by somebody who had 5 coins total." A typical peasant home was small, sometimes so small that if you stretched out your arms, you might accidentally slap both walls at once. The house usually had just one room, maybe 2 if the family was doing well. And when I say well, I mean they had a roof that didn't leak too much when it rained. The walls were made from wattle and daub, which sounds like a medieval dessert but sadly isn't. It was basically woven sticks smeared with mud, clay, straw, and more mud. If you leaned on a wall too hard, you might accidentally become part of the structure. Still, it worked. Mostly. It kept out the weather. Kind of. On the outside, the roof was covered with thatch, dried straw packed thickly like the world's most flammable blanket. Thatch was good at keeping heat in, but it was also good at inviting mice, birds, and the occasional confused chicken. In many homes, you could hear tiny footsteps above your head at night. If you ever wondered what medieval people listened to instead of Spotify, well, there you go. Inside the house, things were even simpler. The floor was dirt. Real dirt. Not earthy, natural flooring. Dirt. And no, it didn't get replaced every season. It was the same floor forever. People swept the floor the same way you'd sweep a beach, basically moving dust from one place to another. Furniture was limited. A wooden table that tilted to one side, a couple of stools, maybe a chest where they stored clothes and things too precious to leave lying around. Beds were made from straw, stuffed into sacks, or piled loosely in a wooden frame. If you were lucky, you had a woolen blanket. If you weren't lucky, well, you still had straw. Lots and lots of straw. But here's the thing. The peasant home wasn't built for beauty. It was built for warmth. It didn't look like much, but its shape and materials helped it survive winter. The low ceiling trapped heat better. The thick thatch roof kept the warm air from escaping. The walls, even though they were made of mud, insulated the home surprisingly well. And because everything was packed close together, the family, the animals, the fire, the tools, sometimes even the food, the house stayed warmer than you might think. But it wasn't perfect, not even close. Cold air loved sneaking in through cracks. There were gaps in the wall, tiny holes, drafty corners, and a door that never quite closed right. Sometimes the wind blew so hard that the house whistled all night like a tired flute. Windows were rare. If you had one, it was tiny, just enough space to let light in and let smoke out. There was no glass, of course. Glass was for rich people and churches. A peasant window was basically a square hole that you could cover with a wooden shutter or animal skin. Either way, the cold still found a way in. And yet somehow this small, drafty house became the warmest place in a peasant's world. Take the central hearth, for example. It sat right in the middle of the room, usually a small pit of stones where the family lit a fire. There was no chimney. The smoke from the fire just rose up and filled the house, eventually drifting out through the roof or the window or any crack it liked. Yes, the home was basically a smoke box, but the smoke also helped keep bugs away, dried meats hanging from the rafters, and sealed the thatch so it lasted longer. Smoke was terrible for your lungs, but great for your roof. Because the hearth was central, the heat spread out more evenly across the room. Everyone huddled around it, parents, children, the elderly, and sometimes a curious chicken who refused to stay in the coop. Another source of warmth was the animals. In many medieval homes, especially the poorer ones, animals slept indoors. Not because people were treating them like pets, but because heat was heat. A cow in the house meant warmth. A goat meant warmth. A few chickens meant warmth and occasional chaos. The animals stayed near the door or in a corner, and their body heat helped raise the temperature a little. Plus, keeping them indoors protected them from thieves and wolves.
Imagine waking up and saying good morning to your cow every day. Quite cozy in its own strange way. The inside of the home was arranged with winter comfort in mind. Beds were pushed close together. The sleeping area was usually raised off the ground. Even a few inches made a huge difference since warm air rises. People often hung tapestries, woven cloth, or even old sacks on the walls to stop drafts. It wasn't pretty, but it worked surprisingly well. Storage shelves held herbs, onions, dried fish, and whatever the family managed to save for winter. Tools hung from wooden hooks, a pot rested near the fire, ready for the next meal. The home wasn't cluttered. It was functional. Everything had a place, and if it didn't, the family probably burned it for warmth. You might be thinking, wasn't it cramped? Oh yes, very cramped. But that was the point. The less space you had, the easier it was to heat. A tiny home filled with people and animals warmed up faster than a big, empty one. And because everyone spent more time indoors during the winter, the house became the heart of daily life. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a workspace, a dining room, a bedroom, a kitchen, and a social center all in one. It was where families told stories, mended clothes, cooked meals, planned the next day, and huddled together when the cold grew too sharp. Even with its flaws, the peasant home had its charm. The glow of the fire at night, the low hum of conversation, the rustle of straw beds, the smell of soup simmering over the hearth, the quiet feeling of safety when the world outside was frozen and silent. And while the cold pushed against the walls, inside the house there was warmth, not just from the fire, but from the closeness of the people who lived there. So even though the medieval peasant house wasn't fancy, it was a shelter that did its best. It held the heat, it held the family, it held the night. And in the coldest part of winter, that was everything.
If you're listening to this while trying to fall asleep, don't worry. You're already doing better than a medieval peasant. At least you have a mattress that isn't filled with hay. Probably. In this chapter, we're stepping quietly into a medieval peasant home at night, right when the cold outside is doing its best to freeze everything except the gossip. Picture this: a tiny wooden house with walls that feel like a polite suggestion rather than real protection. The wind outside whistles through the cracks like someone playing the world's coldest flute. Inside, though, things are a little warmer, not by choice, but by design. Peasants didn't just sleep in bedrooms, they slept in spaces that were basically everything rooms: dining room, living room, kitchen, pet hotel, and bedroom, all in one. The medieval home wasn't the kind of place where you walk in and think, yes, open floor plan, love that. No, this was more of a we fit everything in here and hope none of it falls on us situation. At night, families pushed aside stools, pots, and whatever project they had abandoned earlier, and they turned the main room into a sort of sleeping zone. Picture a camp, but indoors, and with less fresh air. Beds existed, of course, but only for the lucky or the older family members. And even then, the bed might be a wooden frame with a sack of straw on top. Straw was the medieval version of a nice, plush mattress. Well, actually, nice might be pushing it. Straw mattresses had personality. They poked, they scratched, they flattened, and once in a while, a tiny creature living inside the straw would also poke you back. Fun. Still, peasants made the most of it. They learned little tricks like stuffing the mattress with fresh straw more often, since old straw liked to turn into dust, bugs, and disappointment. They even had ropes tied across the wooden frame under the mattress. These ropes sagged over time, so the phrase "sleep tight" might genuinely come from tightening these ropes. Imagine ending your long day, shoulders aching, and the first thing you say is, "Hold on, gotta tighten my bed." Medieval life really kept you humble. Now, if you didn't have a straw bed, you created what was called a pallet. Sounds fancy, right? Like something you'd buy at a modern decor store. Not really. A pallet was simply a pile of whatever softish things you had at home. Old cloth, extra straw, maybe a fur if you were lucky, maybe your neighbor's spare blanket if you weren't so lucky and borrowed things without telling them.
Peasants made do with what they had, and comfort wasn't the main goal. Survival was. The medieval bedroom, if we can still call it that, wasn't just for humans. Chickens sometimes lived inside to stay warm. So did goats, sheep, or whatever animal the family wanted to keep safe from cold or thieves. The warmth from the animals helped heat the house. Basically, medieval peasants invented the original heated blanket, except it was alive and occasionally made weird noises at 3 a.m. Imagine trying to fall asleep and hearing a goat breathing next to you. That's true medieval ambiance. Let's move to blankets. Now, blankets weren't always soft or fluffy. Wool was the classic choice. Thick, heavy, warm, and slightly itchy, like being hugged by a friendly but overly enthusiastic sheep. Sometimes families would stack multiple wool blankets on top of themselves until it felt like a gentle medieval avalanche. But hey, weight means warmth, and warmth meant not waking up frozen. Peasants didn't waste anything, so old clothes became extra padding, old cloaks turned into makeshift quilts, and animal hides became super warm coverings. Furs were especially treasured during winter nights. If a family had a good fur, you can bet everyone fought for a corner of it. Sharing was caring, but only to a point. Cold winter nights tested even the strongest family bonds. One of the main secrets to warmth wasn't a thing, it was a strategy, a sleeping arrangement technique, a plan, a system. And that system was sleeping close together. Families often slept in the same bed or in the same small area to share body heat. If you've ever slept next to someone who radiates heat like a medieval fireplace, you'll understand why this worked. People back then treated warmth like treasure. And honestly, treasure was easier to find than a warm bedroom in January. But even though the room was small and crowded, it wasn't all misery. There was a kind of comfort in the closeness. Imagine the crackling of the embers in the hearth, the soft breathing of family members, the rustling of straw, and the way that everyone slowly settled under their blankets like a cozy little human pile. For a moment, the world outside, the cold, the snow, the worries, felt far away. We should talk about the hearth, too. The fireplace wasn't just for cooking or lighting the room. It was the heart of nighttime warmth. Families would let the fire burn low overnight. They couldn't keep a big fire going. It wasted wood and could burn down the house, which is not very relaxing. So instead, they let the glowing embers gently warm the room. Sometimes someone woke up in the night to add a little fuel. Not too much, not too little, just enough to survive until morning. But even with body heat, blankets, livestock, and embers, nights could still be freezing. On the coldest winter nights, you'd wake up with frost forming on the inside of the walls. Yes, the inside. The air was so cold that the walls grew icy like a medieval freezer. That's how brutal winter could be. And still, people slept through it, because what else could they do? Winter didn't care. Despite all this, medieval peasants created routines that brought comfort. They talked quietly before bed, shared stories, prayed, or simply unwound after a long day. That small, crowded room became their safe space, warm not because of luxury, but because of togetherness.
If you're bundled in a blanket right now, settling in for a bedtime story, congratulations! You're already living a more luxurious life than the average medieval peasant. Because back then, staying warm wasn't as simple as grabbing a fluffy throw from the couch. Nope, medieval peasants had to get creative. And by creative, I mean they relied on whatever nature handed them, even if nature wasn't very generous. Tonight, we're diving into the peasant's winter survival kit: straw, furs, and wool, the holy trinity of medieval warmth. Let's start with straw, the unsung hero of old-school heating. Straw wasn't just for animals. It was practically a medieval all-purpose item. Need a mattress? Straw. Need something to soak up spills? Straw. Need insulation? Straw. Need to confuse your enemies? Probably also straw. Peasants collected it after the harvest and stored it in the corner of their homes like a precious golden treasure. Well, not treasure exactly, but close enough. Straw mattresses weren't exactly soft. They were more like sleeping on the crunchy side of life.
But straw had one great talent. It kept you warm. Peasants stuffed huge sacks with it, spread it on wooden frames, or piled it on the floor to make sleeping pallets. When they lay down at night, the straw trapped their body heat. Sure, you might wake up with a piece of straw poking your shoulder like it had personal beef with you, but you'd be warmer than you were before. The downside? Straw mattresses needed constant fluffing. Over time, they flattened, grew dusty, and sometimes hosted tiny creatures who were not invited to the sleepover. So families replaced the straw regularly, usually before winter. Think of it like changing your bed sheets today, except way more scratchy. Next up, wool. If medieval peasants could vote on the MVP of winter survival, wool would win in a landslide. Wool was everywhere. Clothes, blankets, cloaks, mittens, socks, and those little scraps you kept because you never know when you might need it. Wool was thick, durable, warm, and slightly itchy. Actually, sometimes very itchy. But peasants didn't care. When it's freezing outside, you don't complain that your blanket feels like a gentle cactus. You just accept it. Wool blankets were so heavy that once you were under them, there was no escape. You were committed. If you needed to turn over, the blanket would say, "Nope, you stay right there." But that weight was like medieval magic. It trapped heat like a cozy oven. Some families layered so many wool blankets that the person underneath them practically disappeared, only a nose sticking out for air like a little medieval mountain. And let's not forget wool clothing. Winter wardrobes included thick tunics, cloaks, and the medieval version of sweaters. Peasants didn't have many outfits, so they wore the same wool clothing every day. Don't imagine a stylish knit sweater from a modern catalog. Think more shapeless wool rectangle with sleeves. But it worked. It kept the cold away, and it kept people alive. And that's better than fashion. Now we come to furs, the luxury item of medieval peasants. If wool was the everyday hero, fur was the sleeping time champion. A real fur blanket was extremely warm. It kept heat in, blocked cold out, and made winter nights much more bearable. The problem? Not everyone had access to good furs. Hunting wasn't easy, and buying fur was expensive. So if a family had one, they treated it like royalty. Imagine a cold winter night. The whole family is settling into bed. Blankets are shared, space is cramped, and everyone is trying to be polite while absolutely not being polite. Suddenly, someone brings out the fur blanket. The room goes silent. This is the moment, the treasure, the winter cheat code. Everyone tries to get even a bit of it, one leg, a shoulder, a corner, anything. Fur blankets weren't just warm, they were symbols of survival and good fortune. If you had one, you were basically the winter VIP. But even small pieces of fur helped. People lined their cloaks with fur, made collars out of it, and used leftover scraps to warm hands, feet, and even sometimes their bed covers. Peasants also used animal hides. Simple, practical, effective. Hide blankets weren't pretty, but they worked. They were heavy and tough, like wearing a warm but slightly cranky animal. But that heaviness trapped warmth beautifully. A hide placed over the blanket pile could turn a freezing night into something surprisingly cozy. But warmth didn't come from materials alone. It also came from technique. Peasants knew how to layer like professionals. They put straw underneath for insulation, wool blankets in the middle for warmth, and furs or hides on top to trap everything inside. Think of it like a medieval lasagna of warmth. Thick, layered, and extremely necessary. They also warmed themselves before bed. No, they didn't have hot water bottles. They had something better: heated stones. These stones were placed near the fire until they were warm, not too hot, then wrapped in cloth and placed under blankets to preheat the sleeping space. Ancient heated pillows. Just imagine drifting off to sleep with a warm stone at your feet. It sounds weird now, but back then it was brilliant. And then, of course, there was the warmth of the animals. Chickens, goats, and sheep weren't just livestock. They were little space heaters. Their presence in the house raised the temperature. If the family couldn't afford a proper blanket, at least the animals helped by breathing warm air into the room. Medieval multifunctionality. Eggs in the morning, heating at night. All these materials, straw, Wool, furs, and hides combined into a system built through experience, tradition, and a long line of peasants who survived winter after winter using whatever they had around them. And somehow, despite the harsh conditions, they made it work. Nights were cold, yes, extremely cold, but peasants adapted. They became experts at layering, insulating, and building warmth out of nothing. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't glamorous, but it was real, practical, and, strangely, cozy. So as you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, remember the peasants who slept on straw, wrapped in wool, buried under furs, and surrounded by animals. Their creativity kept them alive through the coldest nights.
If you've ever sat near a warm fire on a cold night, you already understand medieval peasants on a deep emotional level. Because for them, the hearth wasn't just a place to cook food, it was the heart of the entire home. Without it, winter nights would have been one long, miserable test of willpower. With it, they had warmth, light, comfort, and something to stare at instead of fighting the darkness outside. Tonight, we're going to sit down next to that ancient glow and see how it kept medieval peasants warm through the coldest nights. Let's start with the basics. The fireplace was usually nothing more than a simple stone or clay structure, often built right in the middle of the main room. It didn't have a fancy chimney, not at first. Early medieval homes just had a hole in the roof to let the smoke out, and let the smoke out might be too generous. It was more like the smoke tried to escape and the roof hole pretended to help. So the house often had a soft, smoky haze drifting through it, like a medieval fog machine. It wasn't ideal for the lungs, but, warmth came with sacrifices. At least it kept bugs away. And maybe annoying visitors, too. Nobody stays long in a smoky house unless they have to. As time passed, some homes developed better chimneys, but peasants weren't exactly getting cutting-edge technology first. They had the budget version of everything, including ventilation. But despite the flaws, the hearth still did its job. It got hot. It stayed hot. And when the wind outside howled like a medieval opera singer, the fire inside kept things bearable. Firewood, though, was precious, and gathering it wasn't a peaceful stroll in the forest while humming folk songs. Forests were often controlled by the lord of the land, so peasants had strict rules about what they could and couldn't take. Picking up fallen branches was usually allowed. Cutting down trees? Big no. Huge no. We'll see you in court no. So peasants became professionals at finding the driest fallen sticks and branches. Kids gathered them too. It was basically the medieval version of chores. Once a good pile of wood was collected, families burned it carefully. Waste wood? Unthinkable. Long fires? Not unless you were cooking. At night, peasants preferred embers, the soft, red glow that gives warmth without blazing up like a fireworks show. The trick was simple. Burn a good fire before bedtime. Let it calm down. Then keep the glowing coals alive. Embers could radiate gentle warmth for hours, like the medieval version of a space heater that never needed electricity and only occasionally smoked up the entire house. Some families placed a large iron or clay cover over the embers to hold the heat longer. Others raked ashes over them to keep them glowing until morning. In the darkest, coldest part of winter, someone, usually the lightest sleeper, would get up in the night, poke the coals, add a small stick or two, then shuffle back to bed. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept everyone from freezing. And honestly, there was something magical about that soft, reddish glow. Imagine lying on your straw mattress, wrapped in wool blankets, while the last light of the fire flickers on the walls. Shadows dance softly, the warmth slowly spreads. For a moment, everything feels calm, peaceful, almost like the fire is whispering, "Don't worry, I've got you." But fireplaces did more than warm the home. They gave light. And medieval nights were dark. Like really dark. No street lamps,
No phones to ruin your night vision, no electric bulbs. Once the sun went down, the world turned into a shadowy void. The hearth was the one warm anchor in that darkness, a comforting little sun right inside the home. Families sat around it before bed. This was their relaxation time. No TV, no radio, no scrolling, no YouTube autoplay. They talked softly, told stories, mended clothes, sharpened tools, or quietly planned the next day. Sometimes they just sat and stared into the flames, letting their minds wander. Humans have been fire-staring experts for thousands of years, and medieval peasants were no exception. And for children, bedtime by the fire was magical. They listened to stories from grandparents, tales of saints, heroes, spirits, and maybe a few spooky creatures hiding in the woods. The fire crackled, popping here and there, like it was part of the conversation. You can almost imagine the room filled with warm orange light, everyone leaning in, the outside cold forgotten. But let's be honest, the fireplace wasn't all romance. Sometimes it smoked too much. Sometimes sparks flew out, and someone had to stomp them out with a cloth. Sometimes the fire refused to start because the wood was damp. And once in a while, the entire house ended up smelling like someone roasted their dinner too enthusiastically. Still, life without a hearth, impossible. It was the one thing peasants protected fiercely. If the fire went out accidentally, it meant rebuilding it from scratch. No lighters, no matches. Just flint, steel, and a lot of patience. That's why many families tried to keep a small ember alive constantly. Even while traveling, people might carry fire with them, little containers of smoldering material, tiny medieval power banks of warmth. The fireplace also decided the family's sleeping arrangement. People didn't sleep far from the hearth because that would be the coldest part of the house, so beds, or pallet piles, were usually placed close enough to feel the warmth, but far enough not to burst into flames. A delicate balance. Warm, but not roasted, was the goal. Because of this, most of the nighttime noises in a medieval home came from the fireplace. The soft hiss of sap in burning wood, the crackling of the logs, the gentle pop of something shifting inside the embers. It was oddly soothing. If sleep apps existed back then, the fireplace crackling sound would have been the best seller. But maybe the most beautiful thing about medieval hearths was the sense of togetherness. The fire didn't just warm bodies, it warmed relationships. People gathered around it. Families bonded there, stories were born there, problems were solved there, meals were created there, and on freezing nights, the hearth made the difference between struggle and comfort. For peasants, the fire was hope in physical form, glowing, breathing, steady, a companion in the cold, a guide in the darkness, a gentle reminder that life continued even when winter tried its hardest to freeze everything. And so, in those quiet hours of the night, while the wind rattled the shutters and snow piled outside, medieval peasants slept knowing that the soft red glow of their hearth was watching over them. Now that we've peeked inside the peasant home and admired the hearth, let's turn our attention to something even closer to the skin: clothing. Because in the Middle Ages, surviving a freezing night wasn't just about fire or straw. It was about what you wore and how you wore it. Medieval peasants didn't have central heating, electric blankets, or heated socks. They had layering, plain and simple. Lots and lots of layering. Imagine putting on every piece of clothing you own and then thinking, yeah, this is still not enough. And that's basically medieval winter fashion. The first layer was usually linen underclothes, soft and breathable, though not particularly warm. Linen was like the base of a sandwich, necessary but not exciting. It kept your skin away from scratchy wool layers and prevented blisters from rough fabric. It also absorbed sweat, which was surprisingly useful, considering peasants worked all day and sometimes slept in the same clothes they labored in. Yes, laundry was a whole other challenge in winter. Over that, peasants layered woolen tunics. Wool was magical. It kept heat in, blocked wind, and resisted a bit of moisture. It wasn't exactly soft by modern standards, more like being hugged by a slightly prickly, opinionated sheep. But the warmth it provided? Essential. Wool tunics could be worn for days without falling apart, which was good because washing them was difficult and water was often frozen outside. Next came cloaks and mantles, long, heavy sheets of wool that wrapped around the body. Cloaks were multi-purpose. You could wear one to the fields, to the market, or over your straw bed at night for extra insulation. Some families layered multiple cloaks if they were particularly cold or particularly creative. If you saw a peasant shuffling around the house looking like a walking wool burrito, that's why. Survival first, fashion second. Accessories were surprisingly important. Hats and hoods were essential for trapping body heat. A warm head could make a huge difference because a lot of body heat escapes through the head if you leave it bare. Peasants often wore woolen hoods or even fur-lined caps indoors during the coldest nights. If you think about it, it's basically the medieval equivalent of slipping on a cozy beanie before climbing into bed. Gloves and mittens weren't just for work outside, they were sometimes worn indoors at night too. Cold fingers made it hard to move, work, or even sleep. So wrapping up hands in extra fabric or wool was common. Some people even tucked their hands inside layers of their tunic while sleeping, keeping them near the chest for warmth, like medieval hand warmers, but permanent. Legwear was another layer. Linen or woolen leggings helped keep legs warm while sleeping on straw beds. And remember, beds were on the floor, and floors were dirt. Every layer of clothing counted when the cold was determined to sneak in from below. Footwear at night might surprise you. Some peasants wore thick wool socks. Others slept barefoot because the blankets and animal warmth were enough. Shoes weren't usually worn indoors at all, because that would bring dirt into the house, which is counterproductive when your insulation is made of straw. Can you imagine sleeping in muddy shoes? No thanks. Now, you might think, this sounds like a lot of clothing, and you'd be right, but medieval peasants had strategies for layering wisely. They put on loose layers to trap warm air. They put heavier fabrics closer to the body or on top. They reused clothing strategically, swapping damp layers for dry ones if possible. Every night was a mini experiment in thermal science, without any fancy instruments. Families also had shared clothing strategies. For example, if one child had a fur-lined cloak, it might be wrapped around two smaller children at night. Parents sometimes swapped items, pulling layers tighter or adding extra wool blankets to make sure everyone stayed warm. It wasn't luxury, it was survival teamwork, like a human Tetris puzzle of warmth. And here's something interesting. Clothing wasn't just functional, it was comforting. Imagine sinking into your straw mattress, wrapped in wool and fur, head tucked under a hood, toes cozy in thick socks, a small fire glowing nearby. The layers did more than keep out cold. They made the body feel safe. You weren't just warm physically, you were warm emotionally. That's something modern winter fashion often forgets. Of course, there were challenges. Wet clothing was a nightmare. If a layer got damp, the warmth disappeared, and the night became a struggle against chills. Peasants had to dry clothing near the fire carefully, making sure it didn't catch sparks. That added another layer of planning to bedtime. Sleeping warm wasn't just putting on clothes, it was preparing for every possible cold scenario. Finally, layering didn't stop at clothing. Peasants used bed layering in combination with clothing. Wool blankets, furs, straw mattresses, and even animal companions were stacked with care. Think of it as a medieval multi-layer system: floor insulation, mattress insulation, clothing insulation, blanket insulation, fur insulation, animal warmth. Every layer added to a cozy microclimate in a tiny room that might otherwise be freezing. So the next time you complain about cold toes in winter, remember medieval peasants. They survived nights where temperatures plummeted below zero with only wool, straw, furs, and clever layering strategies. And somehow, despite all the hardships, they managed to sleep, dream, and wake up to do it all again the next day. That's the beauty of peasant winter clothing. Simple, practical, and surprisingly effective. No central heating, no electric blankets, no heated socks. Just layering, resourcefulness, and a healthy respect for the cold. By the end of the night, when everyone was bundled, the fire was glowing softly, and the house was filled with quiet breathing and tiny rustling of straw, medieval peasants could actually sleep through the coldest nights. Layering wasn't just about survival. It was about comfort, family, and the little victories that made harsh winters bearable.
After a long day of work, running errands, tending animals, and doing chores that would make modern life seem easy, medieval peasants had one thing on their minds as the sun set: surviving the night. And surviving the night wasn't just about layering clothes, piling on blankets, or sitting near the hearth. It was about rituals that made bedtime predictable, manageable, and somehow a little comforting. Let's step quietly into a peasant home as the day winds down and explore how they prepared for the long, cold hours ahead. First, there was cleaning and organizing. Even though houses were small and made mostly of mud, sticks, and straw, tidying up before bed mattered. Beds had to be cleared of tools, leftover food, or anything that could accidentally catch fire. Hearths had to be managed so sparks wouldn't ruin the night. Floors were brushed, not because cleanliness was glamorous, but because stray bits of straw or dirt could make the house feel colder or catch fire if they got too close to embers. This was housekeeping with purpose. Every sweep, every adjustment, every small task contributed to warmth and safety. Next came food preparation for the night and next day. Families often had a small meal after work, sometimes leftovers from dinner or a simple stew. Peasants didn't eat late for fun. They ate because their bodies needed fuel to survive the night. Your metabolism keeps you warm, after all. Some families even left small portions near the hearth for late-night snacks. Imagine crawling into bed, straw poking your back, wool blankets everywhere, and grabbing a warm chunk of bread from the side table. It's medieval comfort food at its finest. Then came personal hygiene and clothing preparation. Baths were rare in winter, water was cold, and heating large amounts of it was difficult, but washing hands, face, and perhaps a quick sponge off was common. Clothes for bed were chosen carefully. Wool, linen, or fur? How many layers? Which cloak could be sacrificed for extra warmth? The night's clothing strategy was almost a science. Some families would rotate blankets, fluff straw, and adjust fur placement to ensure everyone got maximum heat. Every layer mattered. Animals played a role here too. Goats, chickens, and sometimes even cows were guided into their spots inside the home for warmth and protection. Feeding and positioning the animals was part of the ritual. One wrong move could mean a goat stamping on your toes, or a chicken wandering across the straw pile. It was chaos, yes, but chaos that helped everyone survive the night. Once the household was organized, families often engaged in quiet activities to relax and bond. Storytelling was a major part of this. Parents, grandparents, or older siblings would share tales about the village, animals, saints, or mystical creatures. These stories weren't always exciting in a modern sense. They were sometimes repetitive, sometimes slightly exaggerated, and sometimes weirdly comforting. But they helped children settle down. Listening to the crackling fire while someone recounted the same old tale about the lost cow or the mischievous fox was a form of mental insulation. It created predictability and security. Songs and prayers were common too. Religious life in medieval villages was central, so bedtime often included a prayer, hymn, or reflection, not just for devotion, but for comfort. Saying familiar words out loud or silently helped calm the mind, reminded everyone of protection from the outside world, and added an emotional layer of warmth to physical warmth. Think of it as medieval meditation, simple, repetitive, and reassuring. Another part of the ritual was checking the fire and embers. The hearth had to be managed carefully. Too strong, and sparks could fly into the straw. Too weak, and the room would cool too fast. Someone, often the lightest sleeper, would stir the embers, add a small stick or two, and ensure the fire could last through the night. The glow of embers wasn't just warmth, it was a psychological comfort. Knowing that the fires still lived meant the family could sleep without anxiety. Then came bedtime positioning. Beds were arranged for warmth and safety. Younger children often slept closest to the fire or in the center of the straw pile, where body heat was maximized. Parents might take outer positions, protecting children from drafts.
Everyone squeezed together, creating a living blanket of warmth. Positioning wasn't random. It was a carefully thought-out system that ensured heat was distributed efficiently. Think of it as a medieval human radiator network. The final step was settling in. People adjusted blankets, positioned furs, tucked stray straw into mattresses, and maybe even snuck an animal closer for extra warmth. Heads were covered with hoods or scarves, hands tucked into folds of wool, and toes buried under layers. Some households had small rituals, like whispering goodnight to each other or giving a pat to the animals. These small actions provided comfort and a sense of control over the cold outside. Finally, silence fell, punctuated only by the gentle crackle of the hearth, the soft breathing of humans and animals, and occasionally the wind whistling through the walls. Peasants slept in these conditions night after night, relying on their rituals, their preparation, and each other to make it through the harsh winters. The process wasn't glamorous, it wasn't luxurious, but it was effective. And there was beauty in its simplicity. Medieval bedtime rituals remind us that warmth is more than just heat. It's preparation, routine, community, and small acts of care. Each night, families followed this familiar rhythm, turning a cold, dark house into a refuge from winter's bite. It wasn't just survival, it was cozy in its own humble, smoky, straw-stuffed way. By the time the household finally drifted off to sleep, the hearth glowed softly, blankets and furs were layered perfectly, animals were in position, and the quiet routine of the day transformed the home into a safe cocoon. And so, as the wind rattled the shutters and snow piled outside, medieval peasants slept, not always comfortably by modern standards, but effectively, securely, and remarkably resiliently. And that, dear listener, is the magic of medieval bedtime rituals, a mix of preparation, warmth, and togetherness that let people survive and even find comfort during the coldest nights of the year.
If you've ever curled up with a warm cat or dog on a chilly night, congratulations! You've experienced a little medieval peasant ingenuity without even knowing it. Because back in the Middle Ages, animals weren't just companions or sources of food. They were living, breathing heaters. And during freezing nights, they were just as malleable as straw, wool, or furs. Let's explore how peasants relied on pets and livestock to stay warm, and how a cow or goat in the bedroom was perfectly normal. First, it's important to understand that medieval homes weren't divided the way ours are today. Bedrooms, kitchens, and stables weren't separate buildings in many villages. Often, the animals lived indoors. Goats, chickens, sheep, and sometimes even cows were housed inside for safety and warmth. Yes, imagine trying to sleep while a goat chews quietly on a corner of your blanket. Charming? Maybe not. Effective? Absolutely. The logic was simple. Animals produce body heat. A few animals inside a small, drafty room could raise the temperature significantly. A chicken or two might not do much, but a goat or a calf? That was a serious source of warmth. And because peasants often shared their space with multiple animals, the combined heat was impressive. Essentially, peasants invented heated blankets centuries before modern technology. Only these blankets were alive, occasionally stubborn, and sometimes smelled faintly of hay. Pets also played a smaller but still important role. Dogs and cats were common in peasant homes. Dogs were often working animals, herding livestock or guarding the property. Cats, on the other hand, were mostly for pest control, but they loved warmth just as much as humans. At night, a cat would curl up near the fire or next to a child, providing both companionship and extra body heat. And it wasn't just about warmth. Animals were part of the bedtime strategy. Parents arranged the sleeping area with animals in mind. The youngest children might sleep in the middle of the human-animal pile to benefit most from shared heat. Animals stayed close to the hearth, and humans nestled nearby, creating a living, breathing thermal network. A family of 4 plus a few animals could turn a freezing house into a surprisingly cozy nest. Of course, there were challenges. Animals weren't always cooperative.
Goats sometimes kicked, chickens wandered into your straw pile, and cats had a habit of walking across wool blankets like tiny furry inspectors. But even with the chaos, the warmth they provided was invaluable. Medieval peasants learned to tolerate minor inconveniences in exchange for surviving the night. Some households went a step further. They built small pens or designated sleeping areas for livestock inside the house. A corner of the room might be cordoned off with straw bales or wooden barriers. This kept animals close enough to provide heat, but far enough to prevent chaos. And yes, families often had to clean up a little mess in the morning, but that was a small price for staying warm. Pets were also comforting in an emotional sense. Winter nights were long, dark, and sometimes scary. Having an animal nearby offered companionship, reduced anxiety, and provided a distraction from the wind howling outside. That warmth wasn't just physical, it was psychological. A soft purring cat or a nuzzling dog was like a medieval nightlight, comforting in both heat and presence. Another interesting point is that the warmth from animals complemented other heating methods. The fire provided radiant heat, blankets trapped body warmth, and animals added localized heat in key areas. Together, these elements created a surprisingly efficient system. Medieval people were effectively running a multi-layered thermal strategy without any engineering degrees. Straw, furs, wool, embers, and animals all worked together to form a surprisingly cozy winter environment. And yes, even larger animals like goats or sheep sometimes slept in shifts with humans. During particularly harsh winters, livestock inside the house wasn't just a luxury, it was essential for survival. Without them, families might wake up shivering, with blankets and layers doing only half the work. We should also talk about interaction rituals. Many families petted their animals or spoke to them before sleeping. It wasn't just affection, it helped the animals settle down. A calm goat or chicken meant consistent warmth, not a wandering, chaotic heat source. And this quiet interaction before bedtime was part of the overall nightly ritual. Feeding, positioning, and calming animals was as important as tending the fire or arranging straw mattresses. By the end of the night, a medieval home might be a little crowded. A small family, 3 or 4 animals, a glowing hearth, layered blankets, straw, and furs, all packed together. But in that crowded, smoky, slightly chaotic space, warmth was maximized. Everyone survived. Everyone slept. And the combination of human ingenuity and living heaters made life in freezing winters not only possible, but relatively comfortable. So, next time you curl up with a cat, dog, or even a pet rabbit, remember that medieval peasants had been doing it for centuries. They weren't just lucky, they were smart. They understood how to turn living beings into thermal allies, how to integrate animals into sleeping arrangements, and how to survive the harshest nights of the year. In a way, their methods remind us that warmth is more than just fire or blankets. It's about community, shared resources, and using what you have creatively. A cat on your chest or a dog at your feet might feel cozy now, but imagine a goat in the corner, a few sheep nearby, and a small child tucked under layers of wool, all together in a tiny, drafty medieval home. That's survival. That's warmth. That's ingenuity. That's human and animal teamwork at its finest. So the next time you think heated blankets are modern convenience, remember, medieval peasants were already masters of layered living heat. Straw, furs, wool, embers, and animals, they combined everything in their power to fight the cold. And somehow, it worked. Not always perfectly, but often enough for families to wake up grateful, alive, and ready to face another winter day.
As the chill of winter seeped into every corner of a medieval peasant home, survival wasn't just about layers, fires, and animal heat. The old saying, "You are what you eat," might as well have been, "You are how you eat at night" in the Middle Ages. Because when temperatures plummeted, peasants knew that staying warm also meant fueling the body with the right foods and drinks. Let's take a slow, quiet walk through a peasant kitchen just before bedtime. First, we have stews and porridges, the staple nighttime fare. These were slow cooked, often left simmering over the hearth for hours.
A big pot of porridge or vegetable stew meant more than just nourishment. It was a thermal boost. Hot food raised the body's internal temperature, preparing everyone for the cold night ahead. A belly full of warm porridge was like carrying a personal heater inside you. Meat was rare for peasants, but when available, it added extra calories and warmth. People often used preserved meats, smoked, salted, or dried, to season stews or breads. The food wasn't gourmet, but it was hearty and filling, exactly what a winter night demanded. And the aroma from the cooking fire? Comforting in ways modern kitchens can barely reproduce. Even if the stew was a bit lumpy or the bread slightly burnt, the smell alone made the night feel warmer. Now, let's talk hot drinks, because medieval peasants had their version of tea or cocoa, warm beverages made from grains, herbs, or occasionally milk. Barley water, for example, was a common drink. It was warm, filling, and cheap. People also brewed herbal infusions, often mixing them with honey to add sweetness and a little extra energy. Holding a cup of something warm, even if it was just grain water, was like hunting a tiny flame from the inside. Drinking wasn't just about hydration, it was strategic warmth. A sip of hot drink before bed could make the difference between shivering under a pile of blankets and drifting off comfortably. Families would often share the drink, passing the cup around, enjoying the heat it offered, and maybe telling a quiet story as everyone sipped. It was warmth, nutrition, and bonding all at once. Then there were leftovers and snacks. Peasants often saved a small portion of food from dinner or the afternoon meal to nibble on before bed. A chunk of bread, a few roasted beans, or a slice of cheese could be the difference between going to sleep hungry or full. A full belly also helped maintain warmth. Digestion itself generates heat, a natural internal heater. Some households had a small trick: warming stones in hot drinks or porridge. Stones would be heated in the fire, then dropped into a cup of liquid to keep it hot. Careful placement was key. Too hot and it could crack the container. Too cool and it wouldn't do much. It was a simple, effective technology, centuries ahead of modern insulated cups. Imagine sipping barley water with a tiny heated stone in it. Weird? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. Peasants also considered timing. Eating too early meant the heat from food dissipated before bedtime. Eating too late was risky, because food preparation and cleanup could lead to unnecessary exposure to the cold. So meals were often timed to coincide with the start of winding down, just as the sun dipped. The fire glowed steadily, animals were in place, and everyone was preparing for sleep. A hot meal at this moment was perfect. Interestingly, some families would use food strategically in the sleeping area. Small bits of warmed bread or leftover porridge might be placed near children or even animals to encourage them to settle down near the warmest parts of the room. It wasn't luxury, it was survival logistics. A happy, warm animal and a sated child meant less movement, less heat loss, and more chance of sleeping through the night. Even the smell of food contributed to warmth, psychologically. Smell is powerful. It triggers comfort, reduces stress, and makes cold seem less harsh. Imagine the aroma of hot stew swirling through a smoky, straw-filled home. Even if your toes were cold, your mind was reassured. You weren't facing winter alone. You were facing it with warmth, nutrition, and care surrounding you. It's also worth noting that nighttime foods were simple and practical. No desserts, no sugar rushes, no caffeine. Just warm, filling sustenance that helped regulate the body's temperature and kept hunger away. Every meal, every sip of barley water or herbal infusion was carefully considered to maximize comfort and survival during freezing nights. And finally, the act of eating or drinking together strengthened family bonds. Even in small, drafty homes, mealtimes created intimacy. Sitting near the hearth with a warm cup or a spoonful of stew, sharing stories or jokes, passing food around, gave the night structure. It turned a cold, dark house into a space that felt safe and alive. even if frost was forming on the windows and snow piled outside. By the time everyone finished eating and drinking, blankets were fluffed, furs were adjusted, the fire was glowing steadily, animals were in place, and children were full and sleepy. The combination of nutrition, warmth, and ritual meant peasants were ready to face the coldest nights with resilience. A full belly, a warm drink, and the glow of embers created a simple but effective formula for medieval comfort. So, as you sip your own warm beverage tonight, imagine a peasant family doing exactly the same centuries ago. The taste might be different, the ingredients humble, but the effect just as cozy, just as calming, just as crucial for survival.
By now, you've met straw mattresses, wool blankets, furs, animals, fires, and hot drinks, all tools medieval peasants used to survive freezing nights. But one of the most important and surprisingly effective methods of staying warm was also one of the simplest: sleeping close together. Imagine this: a small, drafty house with walls that barely block the wind. The night outside is bitterly cold, snow piling up and frost creeping in. A medieval peasant family doesn't have heaters, electric blankets, or central heating. What they do have is each other, and that's enough to make the difference between shivering all night and sleeping snugly. Body heat sharing was the medieval version of a human radiator. Parents, children, and sometimes even elderly relatives would sleep in the same bed or in close proximity. The idea was simple: the closer the bodies, the more heat retained. No fancy gadgets needed, just warmth, cooperation, and trust. The sleeping arrangement was often strategic. Children were placed in the center, protected from drafts and surrounded by the warmth of parents and siblings. Parents might lie on the outer edges, shielding the little ones from cold air sneaking through cracks in walls or around doors. Siblings huddled together like tiny heat generators, while the occasional animal curled up next to someone's feet. It was like a living, breathing, layered blanket. This wasn't just practical, it also strengthened bonds. A shared sleeping space meant shared responsibility. If a child stirred in the night, parents were right there to adjust blankets or reposition them closer to the fire. If a cold draft crept in, everyone could feel it and adjust collectively. Warmth became a family project, something everyone contributed to and benefited from. Interestingly, medieval peasants also rotated sleeping positions depending on the night's temperature and wind direction. The side closest to the hearth would usually be considered premium real estate. Whoever got that spot could enjoy the soft glow and radiant heat, while the rest relied more heavily on layers and proximity. Families became experts in optimizing body heat distribution, even without knowing anything about thermodynamics. Animals also played a role in the shared sleeping system. Cats curled on laps, dogs snuggled at feet, and goats or sheep provided extra warmth in corners or at the foot of the bed. The combination of human and animal body heat created microclimates inside the home. Some nights, a small family and a few animals could turn a freezing, drafty room into a surprisingly warm cocoon. Another technique involved blanket layering with strategic positioning. Wool and fur blankets were arranged so the central sleepers, usually the youngest or sickest family members, received maximum warmth. Outer sleepers acted like a living shield, protecting the inner sleepers from cold drafts. It might sound chaotic, but over generations, families perfected the art of sleeping together efficiently. Noise and movement were part of the process too. Shuffling closer to another person, adjusting a blanket, repositioning a goat, these small actions were part of a nightly rhythm. Over time, families learned how to move without waking others, how to tuck in limbs efficiently, and how to maximize warmth while minimizing disturbance. It was a dance of survival that took place every winter night. For children, sleeping together wasn't just about warmth, it was comforting. The darkness outside could be frightening. The wind could howl like a pack of wolves. But being in the center of the human-animal pile, wrapped in blankets and furs, surrounded by family, made them feel safe. The warmth wasn't just physical, it was emotional.
It was reassurance. It was security. Even elderly family members benefited. Their metabolism might be slower, making them more susceptible to the cold. By sleeping close to younger, warmer bodies, they could stay cozy. And by sleeping strategically on the outer edges when necessary, they could still contribute warmth to the group. It was a mutual support system built into something as simple as where you lie down. Privacy? Forget it. Medieval peasants didn't have private bedrooms, but warmth and survival were more important than personal space. Modern ideas of sleeping alone or having your own bed simply didn't exist for most families. The collective heat mattered more than comfort in isolation. And interestingly, this arrangement fostered strong familial bonds. Being close for survival also meant being close emotionally. Shared sleeping arrangements also influenced how people layered clothing and bedding. Central sleepers could afford fewer layers because they benefited from heat all around. Outer sleepers needed heavier clothing or additional blankets to compensate for exposure. Every layer, every position, every cuddle or nudge contributed to the overall warmth of the group. Even during the coldest nights, this system worked. Families woke up alive, often feeling surprisingly warm despite the outside frost. The combination of body heat, animal heat, blankets, and fires was enough to survive even harsh winters. In fact, sleeping together was so effective that some historians suggest it was one of the most crucial methods of surviving medieval winters. So, as you tuck yourself into bed tonight, think of medieval peasants. They slept in tiny, drafty homes with frost creeping on the walls, huddled together with family and animals. They had no heaters, no warm showers, no central heating, but they survived, and they did it with ingenuity, cooperation, and a surprising amount of comfort. The art of sleeping together reminds us that warmth isn't just a physical concept, it's social, emotional, and practical. Bodies close together, sharing blankets, furs, and even animals created microclimates of comfort. It was a nightly ritual of survival, community, and love, silently practiced in millions of small homes across medieval Europe. Even with straw mattresses, wool blankets, furs, fires, layered clothing, animals, and careful bedtime rituals, medieval peasants still faced the harsh reality of winter. The cold could be relentless. Nights weren't just chilly, they could be bitter, bone-numbing, and sometimes downright dangerous. And without modern insulation, heating, or medical care, peasants had to be clever to survive the frost. Let's explore how they coped with extreme cold, the chills that crept into bones, and the dreaded frostbite. First, it's important to understand how cold worked in a medieval home. Houses were small, yes, but poorly insulated. Walls were often mud or timber with gaps that let drafts sneak in. Floors were dirt, sometimes covered with straw, sometimes not. Windows were just holes covered with oiled cloth or thin wooden shutters, letting in wind, snow, and icy air. So even when the hearth was glowing and blankets piled high, the cold could still sneak around like a silent, invisible visitor. Layering was the first line of defense. Wool, furs, hides, and multiple layers of clothing were critical. People didn't just put on extra sweaters. They strategically layered pieces to trap air, creating insulation around their bodies. Loose clothing trapped more warmth. Heavy outer layers kept drafts out. Even sleeping positions were planned to maximize heat retention, as we discussed in Chapter 11. Every layer mattered when frostbite was a possibility. Next, peasants relied heavily on movement and activity. It sounds counterintuitive. You'd think you'd stay under the blankets, but sometimes a bit of movement before bed or in the night helped keep circulation going. Wiggling fingers and toes, stretching arms and legs, or even pacing briefly near the hearth prevented blood from stagnating in extremities. Cold fingers or toes could be painful and dangerous, so small movements were like a natural warming system. Hot stones played a key role too. As we mentioned before, these stones were heated in the fire, wrapped in cloth, and placed near the feet or sides of the bed. They radiated gentle warmth throughout the night, preventing frostbite in the toes and fingers. It was a simple, low-tech solution, but remarkably effective. Think of it as a medieval heating pad. Some peasants also used alcohol sparingly, not for merrymaking, but because a small amount of drink could cause mild warmth in the body by dilating blood vessels. The effect was temporary, and they had to be careful not to overdo it, because alcohol could actually lower the core temperature if used incorrectly. But a tiny sip in extreme cold, it was another tool in their survival kit. Animals continued to play a critical role. Sleeping near goats, sheep, or cats provided constant low-level warmth. Even if the hearth was weak or the wind harsh, the presence of living, warm bodies reduced the risk of severe chills. It was an energy-efficient method. No fuel, no electricity, just pure biology. Peasants also practiced mental strategies for coping with the cold. They stayed close together, whispered reassuring words, and sometimes sang quiet songs. Psychological warmth, comfort, calm, and the sense of safety made the physical cold easier to endure. In the darkness of long winter nights, knowing you weren't alone mattered as much as blankets or fire. When the cold was extreme, peasants sometimes added extra insulation around the house. Straw bales, extra furs, and even sacks of dried leaves could be strategically placed against walls or doors to block drafts. Windows might be sealed with mud or cloth. Small adjustments like this reduced heat loss and made the interior more survivable. If the cold was particularly severe, people slept in shifts near the fire. The light sleeper might tend embers periodically, keeping the fire alive so the warmth never completely faded. This was a practical solution that combined survival with teamwork. A glowing hearth every few hours could mean the difference between frost-numbed toes and a comfortable, sleep-filled night. Of course, coping with winter also meant prevention. Peasants knew when it was time to store extra blankets, gather more firewood, and prepare additional furs. Winter was predictable, harsh, and unyielding, but with preparation, it could be managed. They didn't just react to the cold, they anticipated it. And yet, even with all these measures, some cold nights were brutal. Fingers could go numb, toes might feel icy despite multiple layers. The straw mattress might feel damp. Winds could whistle through gaps in the house. These were the nights when resourcefulness and resilience mattered most. Peasants learned to endure discomfort, to cherish every ounce of warmth, and to find comfort in shared body heat and a flickering fire. Interestingly, these extreme nights also fostered community care. Neighbors might check on each other, share extra blankets, or combine resources for a temporary shared fire. Survival was often a collective effort. A single family could struggle, but a village working together had a much higher chance of making it through the harshest spells. By the end of the night, after adjusting layers, cuddling close to family and animals, sipping warm drinks, and relying on heated stones and embers, medieval peasants usually survived even the most merciless cold. They woke up tired, but alive, ready to face another frostbitten day. So, the lesson from Chapter 12? Surviving the cold wasn't about luck. It was strategy, preparation, and clever use of limited resources. It required physical tools like blankets, furs, straw, and fire, but also mental fortitude, teamwork, and careful routines. It was a combination of body, mind, and community that kept peasants alive through the harshest winters.
By now, we've explored hearths, layered clothing, bedding, pets, and coping with extreme cold. But surviving the night didn't always mean lying still and shivering quietly. Medieval peasants also had ways to keep themselves warm through nighttime activities before finally drifting off to sleep. Evenings were long in winter. Darkness fell early, sometimes around 3 or 4 in the afternoon.
And with little artificial light, peasants had hours to fill before bedtime. Instead of boredom, these hours became opportunities to generate extra warmth, bond with family, and prepare for a safe, cozy night. The first activity was often chores by the hearth, repairing tools, mending clothing, preparing food for the next day. These tasks might seem mundane, but the movement kept blood flowing and bodies warm. Someone might knead dough near the fire while another swept or patched a wool blanket. Even small movements like turning embers or stirring porridge contributed to personal warmth. Think of it as low-intensity medieval exercise. Families also spent time telling stories or singing songs. This wasn't just entertainment. It kept spirits up, distracted from the biting cold outside, and surprisingly generated warmth. Gestures, laughter, clapping, and small dances around the hearth helped keep muscles active. Even children running briefly to check on animals added heat to the room. Every motion mattered. Crafting and handiwork was another nighttime activity. Peasants made candles, repaired baskets, wove simple cloth, or carved wooden tools. Sitting near the fire while working hands-on kept them warm and productive. A family could spend hours quietly creating items they'd need, their fingers busy and their bodies slightly warmed by movement and proximity to the hearth. For some families, light games and gentle physical activity were also part of the evening ritual. Children might chase each other around a small room, jump over straw piles, or play tag near the embers. Adults might encourage this to keep children awake long enough to finish chores, but not too long to burn excess energy. Movement kept everyone cozy, and laughter added psychological warmth. Another important activity was checking and maintaining the fire. The hearth required constant attention in winter. Adding wood, raking embers, and adjusting placement weren't glamorous tasks, but they generated heat for the entire household. The person tending the fire might even do a few squats or stretch to reach the embers properly, keeping themselves warm in the process. Peasants also prepared bedding and sleeping areas during these hours. Fluffing straw mattresses, adjusting blankets, and placing furs strategically weren't chores. They were warm-up exercises. Moving around, lifting blankets, and rearranging layers kept bodies from cooling too early. By the time everyone finally climbed into bed, they were already preheated for a good night's sleep. For older children or teenagers, animal care was an evening activity. Goats, chickens, or even small cows had to be fed, moved into proper positions, or cleaned. This involved walking, bending, lifting, and shuffling animals, all excellent ways to generate body heat while preparing the household for the night. Even a small dog curled up by your feet contributed warmth as you completed these tasks. Cooking late-night meals or drinks was another form of movement and warmth. Heating a pot of barley water, reheating leftovers, or warming bread involved stirring, moving pans, and adjusting logs in the hearth. The aroma of hot food also created psychological warmth, making the room feel cozy and secure. Some peasants engaged in quiet reflection, prayer, or meditation near the hearth. This might not sound physical, but mental activity kept minds active and bodies slightly alert, preventing the chill from lulling them too early into a rigid, shivering sleep. The combination of reflection, movement, and warmth from the hearth created a balanced nighttime routine. Interestingly, family coordination was key. Everyone had a role to play. Children ran small errands, adults tended the fire, animals were positioned, meals prepared, and bedding fluffed. The room was alive with activity, not noisy chaos, but a gentle, purposeful rhythm. Every small movement contributed to warmth, both physically and emotionally. By the time the night progressed and chores were done, the household had generated heat in layers, from fire, movement, shared body heat, and the glow of contentment from a job well done. Even in freezing temperatures outside, the interior felt surprisingly cozy. Finally, families would gradually transition from activity to rest. Stories and songs slowed, tasks were finished, children were tucked into central positions, animals settled into their spots, and the fire was left in a controlled glow. The room, once active with small movements, became calm. Muscles relaxed, blankets were pulled tight, and the body retained the warmth generated from the evening's activities. The beauty of these nighttime activities was that they served multiple purposes at once. They provided physical warmth, mental stimulation, household preparation, and family bonding. They weren't just ways to pass time, they were survival strategies cleverly disguised as routine. So as you sit in bed tonight, imagine a small medieval home alive with movement. A parent stirs embers, a child adjusts blankets, a dog curls up at the hearth, and the soft aroma of porridge fills the air. The cold outside might be fierce, but inside the house is alive, warm, and ready for sleep. That, dear listener, is the magic of medieval nighttime activities, moving, working, and bonding your way to warmth.
By now we've explored bedding, clothing, pets, body heat, food, and nighttime activities. But nothing in a medieval peasant's winter toolkit was as central or as magical as the hearth. The fire wasn't just for cooking, it was the heart of the home, a source of warmth, light, comfort, and even social connection. Without it, surviving the coldest nights would have been nearly impossible. Let's take a slow, cozy look at how fires and hearths shaped medieval winter nights. First, the hearth's primary purpose was obvious: heat. Houses were poorly insulated, walls were thin, and frost could creep in from every crack. A glowing hearth in the center of the main room provided radiant heat, slowly warming people, animals, and even walls nearby. Peasants learned quickly where to place their beds, chairs, and animals in relation to the fire to maximize warmth. The hearth dictated the entire spatial arrangement of a home. The placement of the hearth was strategic. It was often built centrally to radiate warmth evenly. Some homes had a small chimney or hole in the roof to let out smoke, but many relied on clever airflow to prevent smoke from overwhelming the room. The hearth wasn't just a fire pit, it was a delicate balance of heat, safety, and ventilation. Too little air, and the fire smothered. Too much, and warmth escaped too quickly. Wood management was a skill in itself. Peasants gathered and stored firewood meticulously, knowing that the right size and type of wood could make or break a winter night. Softwoods caught fire quickly but burned fast. Hardwoods burned longer and hotter. Managing logs, embers, and kindling became a nightly ritual, almost ceremonial. Everyone in the household contributed, whether by fetching wood, adjusting embers, or tending small sparks that might otherwise die out. Fires weren't just for warmth, they were lifesavers in psychological terms. Darkness in medieval villages could be terrifying in winter. Wolves, bandits, or simply the unknown waited in the night. A glowing hearth provided not just physical heat, but mental comfort. Its flickering light, gentle crackle, and glowing embers reassured peasants that they were safe, cozy, and at home. Even the design of the hearth contributed to its effectiveness. Many had a raised stone or clay platform, allowing pots and kettles to sit directly over the flames. This way, food cooked while the fire radiated heat. Cooking and heating became combined strategies. Food warmed bodies from the inside, fire from the outside. Multitasking at its coziest. Animals and family members naturally gravitated toward the fire. Cats curled on the hearth's edge, dogs stretched nearby, and children and adults positioned themselves strategically. A hearth became a social hub, a gathering point that kept everyone close, warm, and engaged. It was common for the family to sit near the hearth even after chores were finished, sharing stories, songs, and laughter. In essence, the hearth didn't just heat bodies, it warmed hearts. Maintenance of the fire required attention and care. A dying fire meant cold and discomfort. So someone, often the lightest sleeper, would tend the hearth periodically.
Stirring embers, adjusting logs, or adding kindling ensured that warmth persisted throughout the night. This quiet vigil was a crucial part of medieval winter survival, almost like a nightly guardian keeping the cold at bay. The fire also influenced bed placement and layering strategies. Beds closer to the hearth received more heat, so families would often rotate sleeping positions on particularly cold nights. Even the youngest children, positioned in the center for warmth, benefited indirectly from the hearth's glow. Strategically, the hearth worked in tandem with clothing, bedding, and body heat to create the coziest possible environment in a drafty, snow-filled world. Interestingly, fires were also a measure of resourcefulness. Peasants had to balance fuel conservation with warmth. They couldn't leave the fire roaring all night. It would consume too much wood and risk the house catching fire. So they learned how to maintain embers, feed small logs gradually, and use stones or pottery to retain heat. The glowing hearth could last through the night if managed carefully, radiating warmth even when flames were low. Even sensory comfort mattered. The smell of burning wood, the soft crackling sound, and the flickering light created a sense of safety and relaxation. Modern science tells us that warmth, light, and gentle auditory cues can all trigger a calming effect, and medieval peasants unknowingly mastered this centuries ago. A quiet, steady hearth helped the family transition from activity to rest, signaling that it was time to sleep. Finally, fires served a subtle ritualistic and symbolic role. In folklore, fire represented life, protection, and community. Families didn't just sit near the hearth for warmth, they acknowledged it as a source of life in harsh winters. It was a nightly anchor, a dependable friend that brought light and heat into the darkest hours. By the end of the night, the hearth might glow faintly, embers gently radiating residual warmth, smoke curling upward, and the household completely settled. The fire, combined with blankets, furs, body heat, and animals, had created a warm, safe, and cozy environment. Without it, the night would have been bitterly cold, uncomfortable, and even dangerous. So, when we think of medieval survival, remember this. The hearth was more than a fire. It was the beating heart of the home. It provided warmth, safety, food preparation, social interaction, and psychological comfort. It guided sleeping arrangements, influenced household activities, and shaped the entire rhythm of nighttime life. In short, the medieval hearth was the ultimate winter companion, flickering, crackling, glowing, and never failing to remind peasants that warmth, comfort, and survival were possible, even on the coldest nights.
After exploring straw mattresses, layered clothing, animals, nighttime rituals, hot food, shared sleeping, and the ever-crucial hearth, we've arrived at the final chapter. What can we learn from medieval peasants about surviving freezing nights and maybe even staying cozy in our own homes today? The first lesson is simple but profound. Warmth isn't just about technology. It's about strategy. Medieval peasants didn't have central heating, electric blankets, or insulated homes. They survived the cold by combining multiple simple solutions: layering clothing, sharing body heat, sleeping near animals, tending fires, and preparing warm food. Each element alone might not have sufficed, but together, they created a system that was surprisingly effective. Think about it. Modern life often relies on one or two methods to stay warm: a heater, a thick blanket, or maybe a heated mattress. But medieval families used layering, movement, heat sources, and social connection simultaneously. It's a holistic approach that reminds us warmth isn't only physical, it's also psychological and communal. Feeling safe, cared for, and prepared contributes to comfort as much as a wool blanket does. Another lesson: preparation is key. Peasants stored firewood, preserved food,
fluffed straw, arranged bedding, and checked animals well before bedtime. They didn't wait until they were freezing to act. Winter survival required forethought. In modern terms, this could be as simple as preparing meals in advance, checking your thermostat, or layering clothing before stepping out into the cold. The principle is the same. Anticipate discomfort and take proactive steps. We also learn the power of shared warmth. Humans are inherently social, and medieval peasants used that to their advantage. Sleeping close together, sharing blankets, or cuddling with animals maximized heat retention. In modern life, the lesson is less about goats in your bedroom and more about community and connection. Cozy nights are often warmer when shared with loved ones, pets, or even simply a comforting routine that makes you feel safe. The role of routine and ritual is another takeaway. From bedtime stories to arranging bedding, tending fires, and preparing nighttime drinks, rituals weren't just about passing the time. They structured life around comfort and survival. Modern people might not need to tend embers, but rituals like a warm drink before bed, a quiet wind down, or lighting a candle create a sense of calm and security. The medieval method was practical, but it was also psychologically soothing. Let's not forget resourcefulness. Peasants repurposed straw, furs, animals, and hot stones to fight the cold. They combined natural materials creatively, optimized body heat, and leveraged every available resource. Today, we often overlook simple solutions in favor of expensive gadgets. Medieval ingenuity reminds us that sometimes creativity and mindfulness can solve problems just as effectively and with a certain charm. Food and drink were central too. Eating a hot meal or sipping warm barley water wasn't indulgence, it was strategic survival. The warmth from digestion, the comfort from aroma, and the calories for energy all contributed to enduring the night. In modern terms, a cup of tea, a small snack, or a hearty soup before bed can have similar psychological and physiological benefits. The principle is universal. Nourish your body to generate internal warmth. Another lesson is resilience in the face of discomfort. Medieval peasants didn't have insulation or heating guarantees. Frostbite, chills, and freezing nights were real risks. Yet, through careful preparation, cooperation, and ingenuity, they survived, and often thrived. For us, this teaches that adaptation, planning, and persistence are just as important as any modern convenience. Hardship can be mitigated with strategy, and comfort can be created even in less than ideal conditions. Pets and animals were more than helpers. They were living heaters and companions, enhancing warmth and emotional security. Today, the lesson remains. Companions, whether furry, human, or even a comforting ritual, can make harsh environments feel safer. Warmth is partly emotional, partly physical, and community always helps. Finally, the hearth teaches us a timeless principle. Centralized comfort brings people together. Fire was the source of warmth, light, nourishment, and even social cohesion. Modern equivalents might be a cozy living room, a warm kitchen, or a quiet corner with a favorite book. The hearth represents focus, care, and mindfulness, the understanding that survival and comfort are cultivated, not guaranteed. Medieval winters also remind us of the power of simplicity. No fancy gadgets, no electricity, no luxury, just layered materials, body heat, careful routines, and small touches of ingenuity. The principle is clear. Comfort and warmth don't always require high-tech solutions. They require awareness, preparation, and attention to the basics. In summary, the coldest nights taught medieval peasants lessons in layering and strategic warmth. Blankets, furs, and body heat worked together. Preparation and foresight, checking fire, food, and animals before the chill arrived. Community and shared comfort, family and pets were part of the survival system. Resourcefulness, using available materials creatively to maximize heat. Routine and ritual, structured activities before bedtime made cold nights manageable. Resilience, facing harsh conditions with patience, skill, and ingenuity. As you drift off tonight, maybe wrapped in a modern blanket, sipping a warm drink, or snuggled with a pet, remember the medieval peasants. They faced freezing nights with nothing but straw, wool, furs, animals, embers, and clever strategies, and they survived. More than survival, they found comfort, warmth, and even moments of joy in the simplest acts, sharing heat, telling stories, and preparing carefully for the night ahead. So, next time the temperature drops or a winter wind rattles your window, think like a medieval peasant. Layer, gather, prepare, share, and take comfort in warmth wherever you can find it. In doing so, you're not just staying cozy, you're participating in centuries of human ingenuity, resilience, and the timeless quest for warmth. And that, dear listener, is how medieval peasants stayed warm on freezing nights, leaving us with a gentle reminder. Survival is about cleverness, comfort is about preparation, and warmth is as much about heart as it is about fire.